So, as Catherine mentioned, I represent Glenn Ford, and I was also on his care team as well. And so I guess I'll start by telling you his story, because that's something that he wanted everyone to hear. Glenn was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, and he was raised in California by his grandmother, and then returned as a young man to Shreveport. And unfortunately, shortly after he returned to Shreveport, he was arrested. He was arrested in relation to the murder of a Shreveport shopkeeper who Glenn had done some yard work for, but Glenn had nothing to do with his murder. And that was pretty clear to the police and prosecutors, but they decided to prosecute him anyway. One of the prosecutors later admitted that he was more focused on winning than he was on justice, and that may have been what led him to focus on Glenn, who was an easy target. They put Glenn on trial. They arrested him initially for possession of stolen property, then they bumped that up to murder. And by 1984, they had secured a conviction against Glenn, which was surprising because they only had one piece of evidence that connected Glenn to the murder. That one piece of evidence was the testimony of a woman, Marvella Brown, who was the girlfriend of one of the actual killers. And when the prosecutors put her on the stand, she said that everything she'd said about Glenn was false. She said that the Shreveport Police Department had forced her to make it up. And you'd think that that would have been the end of the case, right? Because that was the only thing linking Glenn to the crime. But of course it wasn't. And this is a story that probably many of you here have heard before. It was an African-American defendant. There was an all-white jury that was cherry-picked by two white prosecutors. There was a white judge, and ultimately they were able to get not only a conviction, but also the death sentence. And that was in part because they had withheld quite a lot of exculpatory evidence that, again, the prosecutor later on admitted that there was evidence at the time of trial that would have cleared Glenn. So Glenn spent the next 29 years, 3 months and 5 days at Angola on death row in solitary confinement, which other speakers here will be able to speak to more eloquently than I can. But he spent 23 hours a day in his cell. He was only allowed out 1 hour a day. And even then, sometimes he chose not to take it because the only hour you could spend out of your cell was to spend time in a cage that I've heard described as a dog kennel. It was only in a very technical sense outside. The good news was that Glenn was exonerated last year. On March 10th, the district attorney's office, interestingly enough, it wasn't Glenn's attorneys who, as good as his attorneys were, it wasn't his attorneys that got Glenn out of jail. It was, for some reason, the district attorney's office on their own said that they had found evidence that convinced them that Glenn wasn't guilty, which was surprising because they'd said for 29 years in all his post-conviction efforts that he's guilty, he's guilty, he's guilty, he's guilty, he's guilty. And then in 2014 they said he's innocent. And the next day, the judge signed the order the same day. He was let out the next morning on March 11th. And Glenn, initially had nowhere to go. And fortunately, he was taken in by John Thompson, who I know some of you here have met. John Thompson is an exoneree himself, who was on death row at Angola at the same time as Glenn. He, after getting out several years before Glenn, started an organization called Resurrection After Exoneration, which Catherine mentioned, and it's a fantastic organization. They help exonerees as they come out of prison and other people coming out of prison who have no place to go. Glenn told me that he believed that he'd be living under a bridge somewhere if it wasn't for John Thompson and Resurrection After Exoneration. And considering the fact that Glenn had terminal lung cancer, he probably would have passed away many months earlier had it not been for Resurrection After Exoneration. So I was initially planning on coming here today to ask people for donations to Glenn Ford for his medical expenses. But since that's no longer necessary, if anyone feels moved to donate in Glenn's honor, I'd suggest Resurrection After Exoneration, which did so much for him. With Glenn's 15 months of freedom, he got out last March, he was able to enjoy life, and he really did. He one of his great prides and joys was that he was a father. He had several sons, and he had a lot of grandchildren. I'm not sure the exact number, but they were wonderful. And he was able to go out to California and visit them and spend time with them. And that was a great joy of his life. And most of the time he spent in New Orleans of his release. And he was able to go out and enjoy the live music and the festivals. And so he really lived it up in the last 15 months of his life. And he was an inspiration to everyone around him. He was very forward-focused, focusing on his family and his friends and what he could do with his life, and was amazingly to me not so focused on what had been done to him. Although he was an advocate for justice, and one of his goals was to make sure that what happened to him never happens to anyone else again, and to do everything we could to make it harder for what happened to him to happen to anyone else. So he had some time outside, and I'm sorry to say that yesterday morning at 2:11 in the morning, Glenn passed away. And it was, in recent weeks, he was very sick. So in some ways, it was a blessing. His pain is gone. And I was there with him and holding him at the time of his passing, and I can say that it was peaceful and it was quiet, and he was surrounded and held by people who cared about him, and it was at his home. So a lot had been taken away from him, but the circumstances of his dying were his, and were about as good as I think anyone can wish for. So Glenn is no longer with us, but his memory is, and his legacy is, and I think he's got a real legacy. He, as Catherine mentioned, he has several lawsuits that are pending, and the purpose of those lawsuits, because Glenn will not, we knew the day we filed them that Glenn wouldn't see the end of it, or we were almost certain that he wouldn't. But he wanted to file them anyway, because for two reasons. Number one, he wanted to try and set his family up with more opportunities than he had been given in life. And the second reason was for justice. He wanted to make it harder for the police department, the prosecutors, to do what they did to him. And also, his other federal lawsuit is against the Angola prison, where he received woefully inadequate medical treatment. And so he wanted to see things better for his comrades in prison. And then he also has, as Catherine mentioned, a state petition for compensation under Louisiana's wrongful conviction statute, which at least purports to promise compensation to wrongfully convicted persons. But in Glenn's case, it has been so far denied. So that fight continues. So Glenn's legal battles continue. And in fact, as some of you may know, he was mentioned in yesterday's Supreme Court case regarding the death penalty in Breyer's incredible dissent that is a damning indictment of the death penalty generally. He mentions Glenn Ford in the context of showing how incredibly unreliable the death penalty process is, as everyone here knows very well. Breyer pointed out that 6 people had been exonerated for reasons of actual innocence last year alone, one of them being Glenn Ford. He talked about Glenn's experience. So Glenn's memory lives on. He is remembered by the people who knew him. His lawsuits for justice continue. He will be remembered at resurrection after exoneration. He will be remembered by the people who knew him. And there will be a celebration this Sunday in New Orleans for his funeral and remembrance. So if anybody happens to be in town, then you're more than welcome to come and take part. So it's been one of the great honors of my life to work for Glenn and to work with him, and I'll continue working for him even though he's no longer here. And it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I feel very blessed to be a part of it. So if anyone has any questions about Glenn or about the process or about my expertise is the civil side of things, not criminal, I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has. Yes,
This federal lawsuit that you had against the person continue for a monetary value?
Yes, yeah, it's seeking damages, and hopefully it will be successful. There's also a class action lawsuit that we did not file, but another group, the ACLU, the Justice Center, and a couple others filed. That's a class action on behalf of all Angola prisoners for inadequate medical treatment. And that suit just tries to get things, get the policies changed. So we're kind of hitting them from both sides. We've got someone who got out, suing them for damages, and then for all the men and women who are still inside, trying to make things better. Yes, ma'am?
How can the state deny his lawsuit if it's already been found that he's wrongfully convicted?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it blew me away that when they denied it. The answer is a little bit technical.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Oh, yeah. The question was, how is it possible that when state petition for compensation was denied, when there's a state law that says wrongfully convicted people get compensated, right? The short answer is that Louisiana statute is terrible. It caps the total amount that anyone could possibly get at $330,000. That's $25,000 a year for every year the person was in prison, up to 10 years. And then you can get, if you make an additional showing, you can get another 80 grand for lost life opportunities. But to get it, you have to show actual innocence, and you have to prove it by clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher standard than is normal for lawsuits. And actual innocence under the statute means not only that you were innocent of the crime you were convicted of, which makes sense, right, in the context, but you also have to show that you were innocent of any other crime on the same set of facts. In Glenn's case, he acknowledged that he had pawned items for the actual killers because the actual killers were really bad guys. And in Shreveport in 1984, I get the sense that you did what they said. And so he admitted that. And so the judge decided that since he had been in possession of stolen property, she denied him any compensation at all for the 29 years he was in prison. And to this day, he's received nothing for the time he was in, except $20 they gave him when he walked out the door. And I think that's something that I'd like to emphasize, which is, everyone in this room, I suspect, is in agreement that the death penalty should be abolished. But another thing that's really been eye-opening for me is the need for prosecutorial accountability. Because Glenn was prosecuted, we got a prosecutor who admits there was evidence at the time that would have cleared him. A prosecutor who admits that he was more focused on winning than on justice. And yet, as far as I know, not a single person has lost their job. Not a single person has had to pay $1. Not a single person has lost their law license. And I think one avenue for people to pursue is going after people's law licenses, because the law is so difficult to get compensation, but there's no reason why state bars can't be more involved. Yes, ma'am?
I saw the video where the prosecutor went to meet him. I think he was in the hospital ill. And the prosecutor was saying he was also advocating for him to get this money. What has he done beyond this nice little video clip?
Sure.
I want to know his accountability as an individual beyond this little PR piece that he did.
Yeah, I've thought about that too. The question was, what is Marty Stroud, the prosecutor who came and apologized to Glenn? What has he done? What steps has he taken beyond just an apology? The steps he took was, he sent a letter to the editorial page of the Shreveport Times, apologizing, calling for Glenn to be compensated, and calling for an end to the death penalty, which is just an apology, but that's so rare for a prosecutor to apologize that it elevated Glenn's story from what was essentially a local news story, and it made it a national and international news story. So there was that huge benefit. Marty also, I have to be honest, made a very small donation, less than $100. Medical care, which seems small to me, but he is also a defendant in one of these lawsuits. So there may be more accountability and perhaps compensation coming down the line from Marty Stroud. Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned 2 lawsuits. Were those 42 U.S.C. 1983s? And number 1, and number 2, how far have you gotten? Have you got to summary judgment or anything close to that?
Yeah. The question was, are the two federal lawsuits, are they Section 1983 lawsuits, and how far along are they? The two federal lawsuits are both, the main sort of core of the claim is 42 U.S.C. 1983, which, for those not familiar, is the U.S. federal law that allows you to get compensation if your civil rights have been violated. So yes, that's the core of the two federal lawsuits, and they're in their very initial stages. So we haven't gotten to summary judgment yet. There's been some motions to dismiss filed, but not yet decided on. It's been an artificially accelerated case, in part because Glenn was dying, and so we had to move things along to get Glenn's testimony recorded, as much of it as we could. And unfortunately, we were not able to get all the testimony that I wish we'd been able to get from him before he passed away. But I had great hopes for these lawsuits, and I had a very frank conversation with Glenn when we were talking about filing them, because being involved in a lawsuit is never fun, even if you're the plaintiff, and it's unpleasant and it's tiresome. And this was the last months of his life, but he told me that he wanted to do this because he wanted justice, and he wanted to see his family with more opportunities than he had. So, in the back.
So, this is a question you probably can't answer completely. Why are there laws so the prosecutor prosecute someone who knows innocent, hide exculpatory evidence, and they're seeking the death penalty? Why are they put on trial for attempted murder? Because that's really what it is.
Yeah, great question. And the question was, how is it that there aren't laws, accountability for prosecutors? And when, if they know someone's innocent and they're putting them on death row, that should really, in one sense be considered attempted murder. And that's exactly the phrasing that I heard from John Thompson, who was a death row exoneree. I think I heard Glenn say the same thing, that this is attempted murder, which is what was done to them. It's hard to say why exactly, but it is shocking. I don't think people in this country broadly understand to what extent prosecutors are immune to liability for what they do in their role as a prosecutor. The Supreme Court, and just generally America, has made it very hard to sue prosecutors, and it's given them immunity for many things, far beyond the immunity that police officers are afforded. And I think a lot of the conversation in America about criminal justice recently has been about police, which is completely appropriate. There's a lot of problems with police accountability, but I think part of the untold story is prosecutorial accountability, because prosecutors have so much power, especially when a vast majority of cases never go to trial. The real power lies in the hands of the prosecutor to make deals. And yet, it's very hard to know what prosecutors do, hold them accountable, and sometimes there's not even any guidelines. I was reading in Breyer's dissent that most DA's offices don't even have guidebooks or handbooks or manuals for how to execute or exercise their discretion. So I think it's a conversation that needs to be had, and I think the laws should change. So thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it.